For those of you that were here the week after Easter, when last time that I was preaching, you remember the story about Thomas, the doubting Thomas. Unfortunately, that he got that nickname, that the one who doubted, but who wouldn't doubt? That all these other disciples are telling him that they had seen Jesus, and he's going, "Oh yeah, really? Come on." And so we get that nickname, and we continue that on. But I read the story again, and I look in it, even the disciples, before they had that first resurrection experience, they too said they doubted. They were wondering what was going on, and they couldn't figure it out. But they're not the ones that got the moniker. It was poor Thomas who got the name Doubting Thomas. He's no different than you and I. We all have our doubts. We all have our concerns. We think about what God is trying to do, and sometimes we're not exactly sure. But what we learned about those doubts is that first, there is a difference between doubt and disbelief. Just because we doubt doesn't mean that we don't believe. But doubts always creep up. They always come in. We have questions. And so when we do have those questions, we can continue to move forward, because if we're honest about it and open about it, we can discern it. We found out that before we can overcome those doubts, that we had to confront them. We had to isolate. What is the cause of our doubt? What created the doubt to begin with? What is it that made me think that something is wrong? And so as we confront that and we isolate it, if it's something that we can name, then we can deal with it. And then the second thing that we learned is that once we identify it, we deal with it, is that we have to be able to communicate that. First, we have to communicate it with ourselves, and then we can communicate with our friends, our neighbors, our family, some people around us who continue to support us, to encourage us. That's what Thomas did. He communicated his doubts to his brethren, and they might not have been as helpful as you would, but that happens. People are there to help us on our journey to continue forward. So once he communicated that and gets it out in the open, then again, you can deal with those doubts. The third thing that he did was then to investigate. It is up to you to continue to search out the answers, to find out. You can go to a pastor. You can go to the radio. You can go read. You can go find out for yourself. But you are to investigate. You don't have to take all of the preacher's words for it. You can take my word for it, but you don't have to take every preacher's word for it. I'm just telling you. You can investigate and find out for yourself these things. And typically, when you investigate, when you keep an open mind, when you think about it and you are open to the possibilities, then God will reveal himself. We still have to take that step of faith. When we have those doubts, we can move further from God, or we can take those steps and move closer to God. But in the end, we do have to take that step of faith to overcome our doubts. But doubt is not the only thing that we have. We had Easter. Easter was a great day. It was a wonderful day. As a pastoral staff, we love Easter. Everybody shows up. Everybody's dressed up. Everybody's happy. We celebrate the resurrection of Christ, because all of our foundation, our beliefs, our hope is based on the resurrection. And when that happens on Easter Sunday, what a great day it is. It's beautiful. It's great. People are here. I had some friends surprised that showed up that I hadn't seen in a couple years, and they were here on that Sunday, and it was marvelous. The problem with Easter is Monday comes afterwards. Monday comes, and we have to go back to work. We have to deal with those families. We rush our kids from one place to another. We have to deal with family issues. All of these things, sometimes they can just overwhelm us. And Monday is here, then the rest of the week, and suddenly that Easter has passed us by, and we're living in a post-resurrection Easter hangover. And so it's how do we get past that? How do we continue to go through that? And we're talking about doubts, that's one issue through it. But besides doubt, there's another issue that happens to us quite frequently in our lives, and that's the issue of disillusionment. Now, understand, Disillusionment and doubt are two different things. Let me give you a definition. Disillusionment is disappointment resulting from the discovery that something is not as good as we had once believed it to be. In other words, disillusions arise from the beliefs in systems, government, friends, family beliefs. Beliefs of things that you once trusted, but yet you have found to be untrustworthy. Now, once we have disillusionment, doubts sometimes and often do arise from those disillusionments. But let me give you some examples. Doubts, disillusionment, they can occur. Many different things happen to us in the course of our lives and our journey. One is that sometimes, we take our health for granted, don't we? Yeah, we take our health for granted. Sometimes we have issues, and a lot of you probably still are doing this, have chronic issues that could reoccur. And when that begins, then you start to have disillusionment and doubt. I have a cousin, my cousin Steve. I love Steve. We kind of grew up together. We did things through the summers together. Steve's a year younger than me, but Steve has a degenerative back problem. And about 2 years ago, he lifted something that was too heavy. Something snapped in his back. And so for 2 years, he's been dealing with issues. He went to one surgeon, and the surgeon said, you had to have surgery on it. He goes to the surgeon expecting that everything is going to be well and fine after the surgery. Well, sure enough, something went wrong. Somehow nerve endings got tacked to the spinal cord. That created additional pain that went down his leg, up his neck. It was bad. It was wrong. My cousin Steve has a lot of faith in God, but he has disillusionment with the medical profession. He subsequently had to go through, and I'm telling you, we've got a lot of wonderful doctors here. We had some doctors in the earlier service. I had to make sure everybody knew they're great doctors, wonderful doctors. He's in Alabama, so you don't have to worry about that. But sometimes we get disillusioned by those things. Then there are other issues. So some of you have gone through periods of layoffs in your job. You've gone to school. You trained for a certain place, a certain position. You've done certain things all leading up to where you felt like this was the job that you had and this is who you were and what you did. Particularly if you're in the oil industry, we had some layoffs this last year. People from here and our friends were laid off at various places. I don't know if you know my story. Back in the 80s, I worked in oil-related fields. I worked for a company that made oil field equipment. The economy went down, so did my job. Found a new job. Everything's doing great, going fine, just that, up, the economy goes down again. Up and down, up and down. After about the third time, I said, maybe the oil field isn't where I'm supposed to be. I know we got a lot of you guys out there and you continue to survive, and I pray for you and bless you all the time just to know that you continue to stick that out. But for me, I had to do something different. You become disillusioned. Maybe you've made investments in certain things. Somebody talked you into making an investment. Somebody talked you into doing something different. And the economy goes up and you're trusting that everything's going to be great, and yet we always know that whatever goes up, the economy always goes down. Goes back up, down. If we can ride that out, it's great. But we can become disillusioned in the system. And that goes for government things as well. Here's a hard one. Sometimes we become disillusioned by the church. Sometimes, some of you probably are here. Maybe you have gone to another church in the past, and either the teaching was too rigid, too liberal, too something. You thought that you saw somebody in there that you thought wasn't living a Christian life, but showed up at church and pretended to be somebody they weren't, and all of these things. I've often said, church is wonderful, church is great. It's just those people that are in it that create the problems. But some of us have been hurt by the church, and yet we continue to be here faithfully and to do those things. And when that happens, disillusionments occur. And then there's other issues that happen. Supposedly maybe a friend, a trusted friend, somebody you thought had your back, betrayed you. Somebody, a business partner, a spouse, somebody that you trusted, and then you found later to be untrustworthy. Those are the things, those are the issues, and we all have them. We've all been in that particular spot where we have been hurt by something, some system, governmental unit, individual company, whatever that might be, that creates the disillusionments and we lose hope. So this morning we have a passage. Again, I'm focusing on post-resurrection appearances by Jesus. That first one we talked about was the appearance to the disciples and to Thomas. But before Jesus appeared to the disciples in that locked room, he appeared earlier in the day to two other disciples. Let's read about it. It comes from Luke in the 24th chapter, the 13th verse. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. And as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked, "Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and do not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all of this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. And then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see." And he said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. And as they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus acted as if he were going further. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." And so he went in to stay with them. And when he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. And they asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" And they got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. And there they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true. The Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." And then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. And so it was early Sunday afternoon. These two disciples apparently were with the other disciples when the women showed up and said that the tomb was empty. Now, the disciples that we read about earlier, they're locked up in a room. They're hiding out. But I suppose that some of the disciples decided to take off, to start dispersing. They didn't know what the rulers were going to do. They didn't know if people would be coming after them or what might happen. So some stayed locked up and some left. So we have two disciples that it talks about leaving from Jerusalem, going to a village called Emmaus that's about 7 miles away. Now, I pulled out my Google Maps, and I looked at where Cindy and I's house is compared to St. Andrews, and it is exactly 7.1 miles from our house to this house. And so you know how you do the directional thing on your phone and to give you directions. And it tells you, and you can pick one of the options that says walking time, I pressed that, and it said to walk that 7.1 miles is 2 hours and 19 minutes. You got to be kidding me. There is no way in the world I'm walking 7 miles in 2 hours and 19 minutes. That's a pretty brisk walk to do that. So for me, if it were me, I'd probably, and you got a friend with you, you're going to be taking your time, you're talking, you're enjoying yourself, you're walking along, talking to each other, not to mention the rest stops that you got to take in between, to get there. I'm figuring it's a good 3+ hours on that journey that they're walking along. And so they're making this journey, and on the way, they're talking about all these things that had happened. And that suddenly a stranger appears and begins to walk with them and ask them questions. They don't recognize him. The scripture tells us it's Jesus that's walking with them, but they don't recognize him. And although the scripture itself does not say that they were disillusioned, you see it in what they say to Jesus. You see it in their words. For example, they said to him, "We had hoped that he was the one who is going to redeem Israel." And furthermore, they said that it was their priests and chief rulers who handed him over to be crucified. You see the disillusionment in their eyes? They had trust. Who knows how long they had followed Jesus? Could have been 2-3 years. But they had hope that he was going to be the one. And not only did they hope that he was going to be the one, their trusted system of the chief priests and the rulers, those who had authority over them, were the ones that betrayed him. And so they lose hope in the system that they had grown up in, and they also lose hope in the person that they thought was going to redeem. So what do you do when you have that disillusionment? You had that hope, you trusted, you believed, you had faith, and then you find out it wasn't all true. It was a disappointment. So going back to the question, what do we do next? What's next? How do we pursue? How do we go through those difficulties of doubt, disillusionment? How do we live out that post-Easter hangover, that post-resurrection experience, and when those hopes seem to go down rather than up? And so from these scriptures, I think there are 3 things that we can gain from it and a way to help make our way through. I didn't say that we're going to overcome it, take away. They're not going to go away. We're going to make our way through them, aren't we? The first thing is what I call scriptural fulfillment. Now, you're going to say to me, "David, you sound like a broken record. Every time you preach, you talk about getting in the scriptures and reading and Bible study." Guilty. I am. Yes, you have to read the Bible to get through the scriptures. That's the main thing that we're here for, is to learn and trust in Jesus. And when we open the scriptures, then Jesus is revealed. I don't know if you're like me. When I have issues, you wouldn't know that, would you? When I have issues, things start going on in my mind. They start replaying over and over again. I start thinking about the things I should have said, or the things I could say, or the things that I could do, or what I should have done. And it just goes on and on and on and on. And they never stop. And I have to figure a way to get off that treadmill, that hurt. How do I get through that pain? And often what I do is I'm laying in bed at night. I pull out my phone. I open up my Bible app. And I begin to read the scriptures. I don't know, so I never pick one particular scripture or anything like that, but I begin to read. And as I read that, then my mind is distracted from my troubles, from the things that are bothering me, and I begin to concentrate and focus, and I see Jesus opening up, and I see him being revealed through those scriptures, that passage. When I was in high school, one of the things I like to do is I like to play basketball. Go figure, upward basketball. Why is it? I like to play basketball. I wish I could still play today. It's a little difficult. And But back then in high school, so to play basketball, I wanted to join a, why are you laughing at? Anyway, I wanted to join this church basketball league and team. It's Britain Christian Church up on the north side, and I was a Methodist, but I wanted to join this. But they had this dumb rule that if you wanted to be on the basketball team, you had to be a part of the church. You had to go to worship, you had to be in the youth, or you had to do these things. So my friends were there, so I went there with them, and I got to play basketball and do those things. So one of the events that they had was a retreat, a youth retreat. How many of you been on youth retreats? How many of you come to know Christ on those youth retreats? Yeah. So on that retreat, it was, I don't remember very much about it. I don't remember what was preached that night. I know that night there was a big bonfire. Everybody was around it. I don't remember the songs. I know we sang songs. I don't remember them. I don't remember the preaching. But what I do remember, and it's just as clear today as it was then, is that at the end of the service, there was a foot washing. And some of the others came around and washed each other's feet. And somebody washed my feet. And at that moment that happened, there was like something was lifted. There was a burden taken away. And it felt like my eyes were opened to new possibilities. All I could remember is I went back to the cabin. I opened my Bible. I began to read it. I knew that this was some sort of a spiritual awakening. I read the Bible. And not only was I reading it, I understood it. I hadn't understood it before, and they began to open up, and there again, Jesus was revealed through the Scriptures in my time of need, in that effort. So again, back to that question, what's next? Now what? How do we overcome that disappointment? How do we walk through it? And I believe that we live out our faith by opening the Bible, participating with others in studying the Scriptures. Even though we don't see Jesus, the Scriptures reveal him to us. And so we continue to progress through the Scriptures. The second way that we can progress through is when we live our faith through hospitality and table fellowship. For me, my eyes were open through that foot washing. For these two disciples, it occurred during that breaking of the bread. The Scripture says, when he was at the table with them, he took bread, he gave thanks, he broke it, and he began to give it to them. And then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. If you read through the book of Luke pretty carefully, you can see that Luke uses a couple of different scenarios to help us and the disciples slowly reveal who Jesus is. One of the motifs that is used by Luke is the breaking of the bread, the feeding. Whenever there's a meal that Jesus continues to reveal himself. You have the feeding of the 5,000. How could they not know he's the Christ when he feeds 5,000 people with just a few loaves of bread and fish? And you go figure, how did they not know? But there are other eating stories throughout that Luke continues to try to show them. Another one of those motifs is, and we'll get to that in just a second, but another thing is that when we see this, we can also see a form of worship. So even in our United Methodist book of worship, it talks about at the very beginning, it uses the Emmaus story as a form of worship. So by opening our hearts to God, by expressing our doubts and our thoughts, and then by the breaking of the bread, and then by inviting him in, and we worship, and the Scriptures are revealed to us, we see God in all of its glory. That is a form of worship, and that's a pattern of worship. Inviting, opening up, revealing ourselves, and revealing Jesus. And so in that scenario, we continue as we progress through the what's next. We live out our faith by inviting others, showing extreme hospitality, and continuing to participate in regular worship with the community of faith and joining in the practice of the sacraments. Even if we've been hurt by the church, the place that we need to be is in the church. It still is a place of healing, a place of community, a place where you will find people to pray with you and for you. It is the place that we need to be, and it is the place that we need to invite others to be as well. The third thing that we see in this story, another motif, the first one was the breaking of the bread. The second thing that Luke uses is what I call the journey. Throughout Jesus' journeys from Galilee to Jerusalem, Jerusalem back to Galilee, and all of those things, he's continuing to teach and to tell them and to try to show them who he is and what he does. And yet, even through those journeys, they still don't always recognize who he is. And so in this particular story, the statement, it's a literal statement. It says, Jesus joined them on the journey. And so we get this hope. Jesus is there. And finally, everything is going to be corroborated. Everything is going to fall into place. The women's story is going to be made true. Everything's going to happen. And then the next sentence is that the disciples failed to recognize him. They still hadn't got it, even though he was right there in front of them. How many miracles, how much teaching, how many journeys were they with him day and night? And how much did he try to enlighten them and enlighten us? And still, sometimes we don't get it. As the disciples arrived at that destination, what we learned is that they invited. It said that Jesus appeared to be going on, but yet they invited him for supper. And typically when you invite somebody for supper, you're the host. But somewhere in the process, the roles switched, and Jesus becomes the host. And he breaks the bread, and he opens it, and he gives it to them, and they recognize who he is. You see, all of us, we are sojourners on a journey through life. And even though we don't see Jesus, the question is, will we, you and I, invite him to join us on our journey? Will we take time to invite him into our home, our work, our place of worship? Will we do the invitation? And even though we may be the host inviting him in, he will take over. There's a story that's a long time ago. It's from a story called The River Why. It's about a solitary fisherman. His name is Gus Overton. And he fishes the rivers up in the Pacific Northwest. He's usually a kind of solitary kind of guy. His name's Gus. But he was originally named for St. Augustine. St. Augustine was a church father, a saint of the church. He himself, St. Augustine, was kind of one of those seeker kind of guys. He was a rabble-rouser. He caroused. He did all kinds of things. Anyway, we won't go there. But anyway, he had a friend that came alongside him. His name was Ambrose. And Ambrose befriended him and talked to him about God and shared with him about his life and eventually led Augustine to Christ. And Augustine wrote a book called The Confessions of Augustine. And in that, he summarized his story. He says, our life is a journey. He said, we are made restless on that journey until we rest in thee, in Jesus. And so Gus had a friend. His name was Nick. And Nick was Gus's Ambrose. He shared with him. He talked to him. He befriended him. He gave stories. He's continuing to talk to him about God, about Christ. And so one night he's telling Gus his story. And Nick is a fisherman out in the North Sea. And one night there was a huge storm that came, and the wave rolled over the boat, and it pushed Nick over into the sea. And as he struggled in the sea, he knew that he was going to die. There was no question about it. And then a line was thrown out to him, a hook, and the line was thrown to him, and he reached out to grab it, and it was a hook, and the hook went right through his hand. And it was at that moment when the pain shot through there that he passed out. Didn't know what had happened. The next thing he knows, he wakes up, and he's on the deck of the ship, and because that hook had gone through his hand, they were able to reel him in. And Nick said that when he awoke and he saw the scar, saw that hurt, saw that wound there, that he knew he had been born again, that he was alive again. And he knew that it was a God thing that had happened. And so he shared that with Gus, and so that got Gus to thinking, and so he went home that night, and he couldn't sleep, and he went out and walked up to the mountain about 2 a.m, and he began to just reach out and began to tell God who he was. You know, he was a rabble-rouser. He said, I'm a sorry so-and-so, and admitted all of his faults. And as he said, he was walking along a road. The sun was just beginning to touch the ridge of the mountain. And he said that he felt this chill that started from his thighs and went up to his spine and the top of his head. And he felt this sense of presence. And he described it in these words. He said, it was as though an unseen and oldest, longest lost friend had come to walk the road beside me. I hope all of you have that kind of friend that comes alongside of you when you're in trouble. But he said that was it. That's all it was. He said it wasn't totally over-empowering or empowering. He says it was just the feeling that you get when a friend comes to you in a time of trouble or despair. And he says, and they say, let me walk with you. And that's what Jesus does. Will we make that invitation? Let us pray.